So I'll say good morning again to everyone. My name is Sumaya Ahmed. I'm the Executive Director of the BMRC. We're here today for the BMRC's first 2025 Fall Fellow Speaker Series with Arionne Nettles. The title of her talk today is What We Owe the South, Stories Rooted in Black Culture and Grown in the Great Migration. So the BMRC is a consortium of 28 organizations currently that strives to cultivate and steward a network of all who seek to document, share, understand, and preserve Black experience in the Chicago metropolitan area. So here's just a brief list of our members at the moment. We will ask you to keep a lookout for our upcoming annual meeting, which will be on October 14th. It will be in person at the Newberry Library in Chicago and also streaming online. The research fellowships were started with support from an outside grant in 2009, but still after that grant expired, the BMRC has continued to support researchers, artists, academics, poets, all kinds of scholars and public historians who are interested in doing research in BMRC's members' archives about different aspects of Black experiences related to Chicago history. Many of our authors have gone on to publish books. This is showing some of the books, just a short grouping of some of the books published by BMRC fellows, and some of them we've put on display this past February and March in the library at the University of Chicago where we are hosted. Just to remind you that BMRC's work is done with support of outside donors, and this fellowship, the funds come from what we receive from donors. And so if you like the research and like to support this kind of work, please consider giving a donation to the BMRC. Without further ado, I will turn it over now to Arionne Nettles, who has reminded me that she's not quite a doctor, but will be a doctor soon. So we wish her the best of luck in wrapping up. I'm sorry, soon to be Dr. Nettles is a
Thank
professor, culture
you.
reporter, and audio aficionado who serves as the Garth C. Reeves Eminent Scholar, Chair, and Instructor for Digital Journalism at Florida A&M University. I will let her speak about the research and the work that she's doing in her forthcoming book, What We Owe the South, Stories Rooted in Black Culture and Grown in the Great Migration. Thank you, soon to be Dr. Nettles, for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This is a real honor. Um, as a journalist, first, you're always thinking about how you can better tell stories. And I think I'm just really appreciative of the opportunity to kind of take a lot of take the role as of a researcher in that way. Like when you're reporting, you're kind of mostly just talking to live folks. You let documents do the talking a little bit, but it's just such a very different process. And so I learned, and I'll talk more about my first book, but I learned doing my first book that there are just so many things that I, being in journalism, can learn from different types of researchers, historians, especially. And so, kind of having the opportunity to really do that is just, I'm just really grateful. So, thank you so much for, yeah, for letting me do this type of research. So, of course, I am a summer 2025 fellow, which is amazing. And I am the Garth C. Reeves Eminent Scholar Chair, and I teach digital journalism here at FAMU. So, my first book had a really straight presence. I mean, a really easy thesis. It was Black Chicago contributes to everything, period. Very simple. From a very early age, I felt like Chicago was the center of the world. And that is really what this book was all about. It was just not just Chicago, but specifically Black Chicago and the things that we have contributed to to popular culture was really where I started, and it kind of just started to expand a little bit. And so, my thinking and what I express is that the story of Black Chicago specifically reflects the story of Black America. So, all of these things that we know to be true by being either from Chicago or have ties to Chicago, they are things that actually probably everybody can relate to, right? And so my goal was just to say, hey, this is my story that's about Chicago, but whether you're from Detroit or you're from DC or you're from any other place, you probably have a very similar story. And that, I think, is one of the things that I really was happy about, was how many people from outside of Chicago said, well, I'm not from Chicago. I don't even maybe know a lot about Chicago, but this book felt familiar. And I think that that was one of the things that I kind of really wanted to focus on. For that first book, I was really inspired by the 1619 Project, which really had the premise that everything can be traced back to slavery. Anything you think of can kind of be traced, and there were so many cultural essays in that as well. And then of course Isabel Wilkerson's The Warmth of Other Suns. um just this idea of like, what do we bring with us to a place like Chicago? So I kind of tried to chart through in a way, right? Thinking through like the major things in Chicago, the major events that kind of make Black Chicago, Black Chicago. All this is going to be relevant in 2 seconds. But that was kind of how I worked through this first book. And I aimed to try to think through, okay, what are the areas that make sense? But, clearly there were just like no clear cutoffs. Sometimes I would say, okay, well, this is going to be about TV and film, but okay, wait, Oprah needs her own chapter. Like I kind of would need to kind of break off these sections. I really started with news though, because I think not only is it one of the things that I probably know most about as a journalist, but also news for me is how we tell stories and how we see things. So as a journalist, the way that I try to interpret things that have gone on in history or around the world is that I will look and say, you know what, let me go back to the Black newspapers and see how they interpreted these major things that happened in our world, right? Let me go to the Defender. Let me even go to other places that wrote about what was happening in Chicago, because Chicago was so great and amazing that everybody was talking about Chicago. And so let me try to see that though through this Black lens and how I want to see it. So for me, starting off with the news just made a lot of sense. And so I just kind of tried to do a really wide variety of things. I could not get everything into one book. That is absolutely impossible. But my goal was, how can I maybe just kind of spread over, decades, over industries? Like, how can I just get a wide variety of things? So now for this book, pushing it all forward to my research this summer, was just that this idea that, okay, Black culture is in everything and it's connected to the South. So when I finished the first book, everybody asked me, okay, what's next? And as I started to really think about what I was writing about in the book that was all about Black Chicago, there's just no way to have a book like that without the South. Like there's no way to do that without, so much of the book talked about the Great Migration, right? But what about what happened before people got here? What did they bring with them? So um I always had this idea. One of my aunt, who is kind of like our unofficial, family historian, she always says like, and they brought it with them, right? Like every time she's talking about stuff that like well, my grandparents, her parents brought from the South, or just, Black people in general, she's always like, and they brought it with them, right? Like, and what did they bring? Like, what did they bring? Because, we have this image of like, this image in the middle is like of, I want to say the Arthur family is pretty popular because you see it everywhere, and you see this family who is coming to Chicago and they have their bags packed with them at their feet, and it is, what did they bring with them? Right? And so I'm always thinking about like, well, what do we bring with us? And I started to really be inspired by Zora Neale Hurston's idea of storytelling. So, no one on earth ever had a greater chance for glory, the world to be won and nothing to be lost. It is thrilling to know that for any act of mine, I shall get twice as much praise or twice as much blame. It is quite exciting to hold the center of the national stage with the spectators not knowing whether to laugh or weep. And that is how I feel about being Black today, you know? And so thinking through what Zora Neale Hurston kind of talked about when her idea and her focus of us not necessarily having to be exceptional. Like we are amazing just as we are. The everyday things that, especially when her being from North Florida, where not too far from where I am sitting right now, her idea that just the everyday Blackness of being a Black person, especially in the South, like how Black people talk, how we work with each other, everything that we do is fine just how it is. We don't have to be exceptional or try to feel special or try to amp anything up for anyone else's gaze except for ours. And so that just kind of made me think about, okay, well, really with this story or with this book, I really want to focus on like the storytellers. Like who are the ones that through their work in different industries, they tell different stories. So thinking very deeply about the idea that okay, all of this is connected. Like I still very much think that Chicago is the heartbeat of the country, and I'm going to say that forever. But if we think about it that way, what are all the other pieces that make us this body, right? Like what are the idea of like roots in a tree? Like we are all literally connected in these ways that I think we should be celebrated. And I think that's especially important during a time where a lot of times, Southern culture is not celebrated and not seen as important. I know that when I said I was leaving Chicago and moving to take this job at FAMU, which is my alma mater. So of course, I'm an HBCU grad. Wanting to do work at an HBCU, like at a Black institution, is hey, that's what I always have wanted to do. And people were really negative. People would say, you're gonna move where? Are you sure you want to move there? Right. And so just I think that it is just we need a reminder of how we are all connected. We are literally one body. Chicago, I'm still gonna say Chicago is the heart because I'm a Chicago girl, but we are still all one body, and we move together, we work together, um, and we do have a lot to thank about a lot of those Southern cultural traditions that have kind of like grown and expanded and morphed into something cool and different. And so I wanted to, when I try to think about the areas that really want to continue to thinking through the idea of the storytellers, writing, dance, fashion, right? These are all things that tell very important stories. If we look at like a Andre Leon Talley, who was just this huge presence in fashion, every outfit he had on told a story. Every outfit that he put in vogue told a story, right? So these are all things that are different ways that Black creatives specifically, tell stories. And so some books that I read that I'm just like, oh, if I could ever write a book like that, I would really be cool. Of course, the Imani Perry, Black and Blues, her newer book is really great, but I think South to America, like how she kind of wrote about her travels, really inspired me. Also, How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith. And it just kind of really influenced me to say, okay, I'm going to start my work in the libraries and then I'm going to go some other places too. So again, just these focus on these are the storytellers, right? So literature is where I think is just a really good start because I'm a writer. Zora Neale Hurston is inspiring me, and just thinking through all of the great resources that I had over the summer, that it kind of just failed because I kind of didn't know where I was going to start this summer. I'm going to be honest. I had this really big idea, and so I just started looking through all of the different collections, using all of the finding aids of all the partner sites and saying, okay, I think I want to do this. I think I want to do this. um, and trying to again think through the storytelling because I had like a pretty good idea of the book, but also knowing like, hey, I really want to utilize my time. It's gonna take you a long time to write another book, but what can I do? And it felt like literature felt like something that I could really like hold in my hand, but also, as I'll talk about, I also did still find stuff in other areas: dance, fashion, art, radio, TV, film, all that good stuff. And so, just from this summer, I would say that my kind of thinking, just based on literature, was just that from West Africa to Florida to Chicago, there's a strong Black literary culture that weaves throughout the country. And those continued threads are ones writers like Zora Neale Hurston are responsible for growing. So, I really did a lot of I spent a lot of time at the Newberry. This is where I kind of started. I had never been to the Newberry. I cannot believe that I have never been to the Newberry, and I have literally been telling every single person that I know, hey, you don't really have to be like a researcher. You could just go to the Newberry. And then you get a little card, and it's really cool. So I've just been telling everybody who will listen about the Newberry because I can't believe that I had never been, right? And so I think that one of the most important things for me was really looking at like the original published works of stuff. So reading and touching the words of these older things, like you can't really replicate that on the internet. So I can find Phyllis Wheatley's writings on the internet, but reading a very, very, very old book that has published her words is just, it was a different experience for me. Um, and I actually was like the kid when I was in elementary school. I remember we had a Black History Month parade, and I was Phyllis Wheatley for the Black History Month parade. So that just shows how I think, well, one, how kids are always the same person, but also how we can kind of like think these ideas can kind of be just floating around inside our heads for a really long time. So just thinking about that and saying, okay, well, this is the first Black published work of poetry. And so like just going through things at the Newberry was just, it was just a really fantastic experience. Um, I would also say, again, thinking as a journalist and expanding my thought of how research actually works. In my first book, I did go to the archives, and I'll talk more about the Vivian Harsh library because I spent so much time there. I also, probably spent hours and hours and hours on like the more digital sites, of course, because you can do that from home at any time of the Chicago Public Library. But I when I went into the archives for, my last book, I really knew what I wanted and then I got what I wanted. This was a time where I had to kind of like follow threads, I think, in a way that I don't always have to do as a journalist, right? Like I'm usually like, I want to do a story about this. Okay, I call up the person who is at the head of this thing, right? And this just like a focus thing, but history doesn't necessarily work like that. Creative work does not necessarily work the same way. And so, reading through bibliography books and anthologies and just kind of taking a lot of those ideas that I have for something and saying, okay, I don't really even know what I'm looking for here, but I'm going to see what comes up. So I did a lot of exploratory work, which again, you normally don't have time to slow down and do. Especially as a journalist, you're working on deadline. This is the time you gotta get your story in. You don't have time to just explore. You need an answer. And so being able to say, no, I just want to discover people I don't know, um, stories about people, writers, creatives, like works that I never heard of. Like I just want to have that time to just kind of sit there. That was very special. So one of the people who, again, I'm always kind of like, as a writer, how do I not know these other writers? That I just really, really that I found because I was reading though these types of books that like, are not as targeted where I'm just like, want to learn about Phyllis Wheatley? Get Phyllis Wheatley's book, right? Like this is more of I am open, I am exploring. Was Octavia Rogers Albert. And she stood out for me because she kind of, to me, felt like, if I'm thinking of like who was before Zora Neale Hurston and who's like trying to tell these stories in what they are, I'm who are the storytellers that kind of do that for me. And so she was born into slavery in Georgia in 1853. um what also really stood out to me is that she was really writing at a time where Black writing was still mostly published by men. And so that is kind of how she was described, so she kind of like jumped out of the page in that way. um but even then, like, her writing didn't get published until after she passed away. And so her writing focused on interviews with enslaved people. And again, thinking back to Zora Neale Hurston and thinking about, okay, these are just the everyday people, right? Like the specialness, right? The uniqueness of these stories are that it's not the celebrity, it's not the Black excellence, right? These are people telling these stories, and our stories. They're telling our stories. And so her book was The House of Bondage. And so it had all of these first person accounts. And a bishop named Willard Francis Malulu actually wrote the book's introduction, and he said about her and about her writing was that this volume, penned by a hand that now rests in the quiet of the tomb, is a contribution to the sum total of the story that can never entirely be told. In her young childhood, the author had known the accursed system, and she knew the joy of deliverance. With a deep, pathetic tenderness, she loved her race. She would gladly have died for their enlightenment and salvation. So, this idea that, like, not only are people storytellers, like, they are telling stories for a reason. Like, this is a purpose. This is like a guidance. Um, this is more than just you telling a story because you're interested in a story. This is a part of a movement. The stories that we tell are part of how we educate each other, how we are informed, and we can never fully tell the story of slavery. Like, we cannot even get there. And so we need to continue to tell Black stories as much as possible, especially now as people try to make it so that we don't. So there, it's just so intentional and so important to have like these types of reminders. And so, of course, I didn't only, you know, look up literature and writings at the Newberry. Um, so a couple threads was, especially, well, one important thread for me as someone who loves dance was kind of like this idea of Black dance. Um, I It made me think that I was kind of going to focus from like 1619 to 1970. Um, Viewing kind of concert dance as the greatest resistance, right? Like, you have kind of these formal dance places when you think of ballet, and you think of all these things where like Black folks are not supposed to be, and yet and still we get out there and we tell the stories, and we show up, and we not only just tell the stories with what we, you know, with our physical presence being there, but we're also using the movements of dance to tell the story of our people. And so, the Juba and the cakewalk, these kind of more celebratory dances that have stems all the way back into Africa, and how, enslaved people use these dances. Um, in times of celebration, right? And so, learning more about Master Juba, William Henry Lane, who was kind of just like known as this great performer of the Juba, and then, also learning more about like instruments, the power of the drums, thinking about how those drums survived from Africa to the Americas. So my additional research was done at one of my favorite places in the world, Vivian G. Harsh Collection at Whitson Library. Again, this is where I did go for my first book, but this time it was really different because I didn't necessarily get the home runs I thought I was going to get when I went the when I would get before. So for example, in my first book, I talk a lot about the Chicago Defender. And so going through the Abbott Sing Stack papers, the Sing Stack family papers, like you get so much firsthand account. You get a lot of story. So I think I was hoping that I would find like that story, like that little thing that I would find in those Think Stack Abbott papers that would just, tell me everything, right? Oh, this is from Robert S. Abbott's mother, and this is her handwritten autobiography. Like all of those things are in that collection. And if anybody hasn't gone through it, I would suggest you do. But it's like, so if for a writer, you find a thing and you can pull directly from that thing, right? If I'm trying to quote something, I'm trying to quote information, I'm pulling straight from it. A lot of times I would be in this, looking through some of these collections and I'm like, this none of this is what I need or what I thought I needed when I came in here. But thinking through some of what I'm seeing anyways, right? Like scribbles on the back of a receipt, a hotel notepad. Like, I mean, these things are still important. And I think again that idea of being able to touch it in this new world that we're in where we are so digital, right? And I'm a digital native and I'm always thinking about that, but taking the time to slow down and just, enjoy the things that I am touching, learning about, seeing, and not even knowing how that might play into my storytelling once I actually sit down to write. So the Richard Durham papers were one that a collection I knew I wanted to go into. Richard Durham, a journalist and writer, he created Destination Freedom, which I think people mostly know him for. And it was just a series of radio shows that talked about the Black experience in America. It was just so good and so specific. He also did a lot of other really cool things that we don't have records of anymore. Like he wrote the first Black soap opera, which I have been trying to find the script of for years and I cannot find it. It's called Here Comes Tomorrow. And they said that it was just so, you know, at the time that it was just so controversial, I guess at the time, that the actors would have to like escape out the back door after recording, right? And again, so of course the soap opera is a radio drama because we're talking about mid-century here. Um, but these are just again the storytellers. And then the Wiley Amos papers. So like, if anybody loves Famous Amos cookies. That is this entrepreneur. He's actually from where I am right now in Tallahassee, Florida. And the original chapters of his book are in his paper. So you see his handwriting, stuff he's crossed out, right? And so you're just like, I'm like really getting to know him growing up. He's talking about growing up in Tallahassee, moving to New York as like a teen and like that the transition from being in the South to being in the North. It's just really interesting and really good stuff. And I really was just kind of like, I have no idea how I'm gonna use it. I'm gonna use it. I have no idea. And again, that goes against kind of maybe the idea sometimes as a journalist, you kind of know what you're getting and how you're gonna use it. A lot of this stuff I'm like, I have no idea how I'm gonna use it, but I loved getting it. Um, Edith Wilson papers. She was a blues singer and vaudeville performer. She did a lot of things, radio, TV. I think a lot of people do maybe know her because she was one of well she called herself the last Aunt Jemima, but she was one of like the last that would kind of be in rotation before there were no more things. But she played Aunt Jemima, and so it was again, she's just a pretty cool, influential person, and in her papers is definitely where I just would find like a matchbook. Okay, like, but I'm just learning more about her and these things, and I don't know how I'm gonna use it, but I know I'm gonna use it. So some of my like great research takeaways was just that being open to exploring. Um, I know that again, if people feel that they are just super seasoned researchers in this more traditional research way, they might not have to have a problem with this, but I think coming from different disciplines, you have to maybe switch on a different part of your brain and just being open to like, I don't know what I'm gonna find, but just let me just explore these things. Like I have the opportunity to touch and to feel and to read these things. I don't really know what I'm doing with it, but let me just be open to that exploring. Also taking necessary pivots. I'm a planner. I had a spreadsheet and I had, outlines and I had all this stuff that I thought was going to really kind of put me in a certain thing. And most of the time when I went to a lot of a lot of my research trips, I mean, it was good to have a plan. But you got to pivot. You got to pivot if that's not what you're finding, that's not what you're seeing, being open to looking in different places. In journalism we would say that is letting your reporting really guide you and not trying to guide the reporting. Like you can't make the story. And so really letting myself do that was tough. And then nothing is a waste of time. So, not feeling bad if I am excited about reading something and then it doesn't give me again what I have thought in my head I'm supposed to walk away with, and just being truly truly open. So yeah, I had a fantastic experience, and I am actually a little not I don't want to say overwhelmed with my great things, but I think that what I really walked away with was a lot of like really clear lines and focuses for more research because of course, I mean, I know some people came in to the research fellowship with a more specific goal, like I'm going to do this one thing on this one person and look in here, and I kind of had a really really wide goal that I'm saying I'm just gonna prove and tell everybody that all of these things about being black and black culture and black history and black storytelling. And it was a big undertaking, and so I think just again, I'm walking away though so much more ready to like finish the book and really get into the book. And I really love that slide that had all of the books that different fellows in the past or different researchers in the past have um, written using the BMRC resources, because a couple of those books I am familiar with because I used them for my first book, right? And so it's just like this beautiful cyclical thing that makes sense when it makes sense. And that's it. That's all I have.
Thank you so much, Ariane. I really appreciate it. It was great to hear about your experience in the BMRC archives. So this may, I'm not trying to put you on the spot, but your question that you ask of what we owe the South is a very potent question.
Yeah.
So my, the question I really want to ask you is, so what did you come away learning about what we owe the South or what people from Chicago think we owe the South? But if that's not, if that's something you want to say for your book, then
No, no.
then another question I would ask is, why do you think the question seems so important to people in
Yeah,
Chicago?
yeah. So I would say is that I think that we owe a lot of our cultural foundation to the South. I think that it is absolutely true that what we have in Chicago is uniquely ours and that we build upon, right? So, like, if you think about the blues in Chicago is what people might say is a more quote unquote urban or modern sound. Like, it sounds like you are in a big city and it is different, but we would not have that blues to build upon if it weren't for people coming on up during the Great Migration and taking those kind of like essences of like what the blues was in the Mississippi Delta to Chicago. And so I think that we owe like a really important part of our foundation to the South. But I do think that, it's just such a big question. And I'm sure that everybody's not going to answer it the way that I would answer it, because maybe what's important to me or what I take away is not the same. But I think that it is important to people in Chicago because we didn't just appear. Well, I don't want to say it that way, because we know from, Jean Baptiste Point du Sable that we have been in Chicago for a while, right? However, the massive number of Black people in Chicago is what sets us apart from other places that are nearby us, right? Like that's why people will say Chicago and then you'll jump kind of to Detroit because there's a bunch of other places in the Midwest that have a lot of Black people, but having such a big population of Black folks in a city allows you to shape the culture of that city in a way that perhaps people might not be able to do if there's just just the numbers aren't there. So not to say they weren't doing great work in other places, but it's kind of like I don't really know what y'all were doing in Ohio, but here in Chicago, this is kind of what it looked like.
So my question sort of builds on Sumaya's question, and I guess it's a general question of like to what extent or why is regional identity important to Black identity and to the nation?
Oh, I love that question. I love it so much. And I think because regionally we do have our I our ties, so like I think that if you naturally talk to Black folks in Chicago, they will say I am a Chicagoan, right? They'll even say, well, I don't say I'm just from Illinois, say I'm from Chicago, right? And so there is a amount of pride that we have in the places that we come. I also think, and this is from me and my thought process, but also I feel like from people I've talked to and from the work the interviews I've done, right? I think that it does also tie to the fact that as descendants of slavery in America, our traditions are often regional. So, how you grew up and the clothes that you wear and the music that you listen to, like these are all traditions, right? And they are cultural and they are important. And it feels so important to celebrate those things because of the fact that, like, I can't tie my identity back to any culture in Africa. I can't take claim on any of those, right? I can maybe, you could do a DNA test, you can appreciate it and say, oh, I'm, this part, but those cultural traditions are not cultural traditions that I grew up with, and I can't steal them. Like, I can't take them. But to honor that we built a culture here, like, we did have it, and it looked different pre internet in a way that is like and even now it is still very unique. Like I when I go to, let's say, just a party here in Tallahassee, it is very different from the party that I go to in Chicago. And that's also different from the party that I go to in DC. And that's different from the party that I go to in Texas. And like all of these places, right? We have these cultural differences from just even the music we play, the outfits we wear, like all of these things are so different how we move. But they aren't bad differences. They're good differences that we should celebrate. And I use dance a lot as an example because I try to explain to my students that when I first came down to Tallahassee to go to school, nobody here had heard of footwork because I'm from Chicago and we footwork. And nobody here had really heard of it. And they didn't play house music at the parties and people dance differently, right? But how we dance in Chicago, when we footwork, it might sound similar or look similar to people jitting in Detroit, but that's a whole different dance. And they're just right down the street. Or house music might sound similar to go-go music in certain ways, but it's not go-go music. Like that is a DMV music. And so all of these things are special and cool, and they're things that we can take pride of, and we don't have to feel as if we don't have a culture because we can't necessarily tie to certain things. Like the things that we grew up with and those traditions are also important.
I have a question if there's space to ask it. Um, just building on um, the conversation. First of all, thank you for your wonderful presentation. Thank you for your investment in Chicago culture and history, and thanks for being one of our fellows. I'm Steve Adams, current board chair of the Black Metropolis Research Consortium, and I wanted to ask about how, when you talk to people about your interests, what kinds of I'm wondering how it's resonating across generations. Like
Okay.
you're talking to young people about Chicago history that is some of which is of course history that far precedes you,
Yeah.
Some might be contemporary, but I'm wondering about how curious um, different generational groups are about your work and how people are engaging you, how what kind of reception you're getting.
Yeah, that's great. So, I am unsure of the newest reception because I think that sometimes when you talk about the South, people are like, okay, but we in Chicago. Why are you talking about it?" Right? So that has so far been like, okay, I'm just wait and see. I'm gonna show you. I'm gonna make the connections for you. I promise. That's my job, and I'm gonna do it. So people haven't been, they've just been a little wary maybe overall of the new book. They're like, "Ugh, I don't know. I meant they're kind of like when I said what's next, I really meant mm, Chicago Part 2. Like that's really what they were wanting. Um, they're like just more Chicago. We're Chicago. It's just more Chicago. But I think overall, I do think that like it has been so refreshing how different generations have been open to it. So I think, like my parents' generation and people who are older than them, even who have read the book or kind of even read parts of it, they have seen or expressed like an appreciation for not forgetting about the past. So it's a good reception, but I think their reasoning is like, whew, okay, books. We're back to books and documents and history and I often get, oh, I used to be there or I used to go there. Did you? And they'll just start sharing their stories with me. Did you look into so and so? Because back in my, and it is so fun and refreshing at how it's kind of opened up those conversations. I would say like kind of the millennial-ish ages, like those kind of my generation, they are just kind of like, oh, this is cool. Okay, I didn't know it was this cool. But yeah, it's I get extra bragging rights from being from Chicago and all of these cool things. Let me brag on it some more. And then the younger generation, I think that they have just been kind of, hmm, I didn't really know Chicago was this cool. Like, I think versus, all the generations above, we might have had an inkling, even if we couldn't put it in words. Like you might say, Chicago is really influential in music, and not everybody can express verbally what that means. But the younger generation, they're really like, I had no idea Chicago was this cool. And so I'm like, here are your bragging rights. Like, take it and move. Don't let anybody tell you that you are from a place that is just has this wild narrative of not the great things happening. Like, you are from a great place and you are from great people, and like, just take it and run with it. So that has been like also really refreshing.
I'm Abra Johnson. I'm actually a member of Honey Pot Performance, which is one of the members of BMRC. And we have been working on an archive called the Chicago Black Social Cultural Map. And I'm curious, we've been looking at the Great Migration, which is more of my focus, but specifically the connections of disco and house music
Mm,
to great migrants here in Chicago. So um, and just coming from a different Southern background in Chicago, I hear people talking about Mississippi and Louisiana, Arkansas.
mhm.
But my folks are South Carolina, Santa
Okay.
Helena, South Carolina, Ossabaw Island. So Geechee folks who
Hmm.
do very much see themselves as Africans. They do not see themselves as like that far removed. And yet my mother saw herself as very much Chicago.
Hmm.
So Chicago Geechee is what Emory Campbell called us. But I am curious about to what extent do we see the South as connected not only to contemporary forms like footwork, but what you see in terms of what becomes house music, or maybe, and I don't know how to ask it, to think about what um, house music as also a queer Black space,
Yeah.
um, a queer Black safe space, and to what extent do we see that in Southern, older Southern histories? And
Yeah.
perhaps how we've kind of migrated that down, even footwork too. I think about Murder Mommy.
Mhm.
So I'm curious about that, like the generations of Black Southern, but also queer folks? And what do those
Mhm.
spaces and histories look like in Black pop culture for you, for the research that you've seen?
Yeah, yeah. And so I think that when we talk about this reverse migration of people from places like Chicago going back to the South, I think that is where we often see that influence kind of looking different. So, like, for example, a lot of us at HBCUs, like you can kind of see like a lot of work that definitely needs to be done as far as like supporting and creating a safe environment for like LGBTQ plus people. And so like I know a lot of my students have expressed that like on HBCU campuses they don't feel as safe, right? In that way, right? Safe to be themselves, which is part of when we talk about like really old school respectability politics when it comes to Black folks. Like sometimes we are we still keeping it going in a lot of places, right? But then when we talk about like house music and those spaces seem to still be like a place where it can be a little bit more freeing, right? But like for example, right now I am in Florida and I have yet to see a house party with house music. They will play um the percolator from 1990 whatever, and that is like all you get. They'll play like the percolator or something and say where's Chicago at, and that's all you get. So a lot of that reverse has not permeated everywhere, I don't think, and in the South yet, right? I think, but it's like kind of the thing because you're like pulling people in. So for us, for example, when we first got on campus, it was 2003. People were like, we do not listen to any of that. And then we actually got booed. I tell a story about this in my book. Is that like our first performance? We were footworking and they booed us. They were like, "Boo! What is that? It looks stupid." Boo! And they started booing us. And it took us about a semester for us to get him. And then by the time we got to like spring semester, they would start clapping for us. They would start screaming. They knew one house track that was just like, hey, hey, hey. And they would say that. The people would say that to me as I was just walking to class. Like they're like, you're that girl that that does that stuff on the stage. And so it's kind of like this exposure. And I do think in a lot of ways, like we're a little late with it coming back. So yeah.
I wanted to ask about your research about like other music, like jazz or blues, or were those perhaps other spaces of safety for the sort of sexually marginalized or older Black folks who I just think about some of the folks here, like Ma Rainey, Lucille
Mhm.
Smith, and I wonder, if there were spaces like that and that you came across in the South. So even if not house music, maybe like other forms where we saw these sort of hidden networks of
Yeah.
safety.
Yeah, this kind of idea of like we kind of see it in like the color purple, right, with the juke joint and stuff. Now, I will say is that I love that you brought that up because I need to look more into it, because I don't know, but there has to be, right, and so like dedicating some time to like what does that look like, and so I think I had been so focused on like the migration up, I hadn't been thinking as much about the migration down, and then also like the things that are super niche where it's like they're important, right? Like those safe spaces are important. And so I really appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah, yeah. So I don't have an answer for you yet, but like I'm gonna get it.
Thank you so much, Ariane, and thank you, everyone, for this the great questions. And we appreciate everyone being here. And we hope that people can maybe join us for our next talk, which will be on the 30th of September with Dr. Ada Onyewunyi will be on our website. We'll be talking about exploring educational journeys of African immigrant youth in Chicago from 1980 to the present. Thank you, everyone. We appreciate you being here. Bye-bye.